Welcome back. We hope you had nice conversations during the coffee break. Our next session is a plenary that is called Bridging Divides in European Society Through Inclusive Partnerships and Sustainable Interventions, and is dedicated to present the input paper for the high-level dialogue on social cohesion that was written by Dr. Friederike Mead that will be commented by several experts. So without further ado, we ask our very own Robert Templar, the director of the programs department at the International Dialogue Center KAICIID, to proceed together with his commentators.
Hello, everybody. We are unfortunately running a little bit late, so I'm afraid we're going to have a slightly compressed program. We have a very eminent and quite large panel, so I would urge everyone to be fairly succinct in their comments. I would just like to take one small moment to say, on behalf of all of my colleagues at KAICIID, a great thank you to our Secretary General. He does an extraordinary job on a daily basis. We witness his immense hard work and dedication every day, and we would like to say thank you. And to he's not unfortunately in the room because as always he's juggling about a dozen different things today. But I would like to publicly thank him for all of his work. And without further ado, we're going to go to Dr. Friederike Mead, who has written 2 research papers for us, including the input paper that is available to you all, and she's going to give us a brief outline of that.
Yes, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for the introduction. And I would like to also say thank you for the opportunity to be at this meeting where so many people from different sectors are coming together. And this is such a great opportunity to talk about our topic, how to create sustainable partnerships in countering hate speech. I would like to share with you today some of the findings of a research, mapping research that I conducted for KAICIID in the past few months. And in that research, I looked at how religious actors are actually working on the ground in countering hate speech, looking at their experiences, looking at the best practices that they can share. So there are 2 papers that are connected to this research, and one you are able to read today, and there's a larger one that will be published later on this year. By way of introduction, I would like to recapitulate on a couple of challenges in the fight against hate speech, with the danger of being a little bit repetitive, but it also shows the complexity of the issue. Hate speech remains an incredibly complex and a very cross-cutting phenomenon. It makes it very hard to define it. It has to be redefined in every specific context where we're working on hate speech with different actors together. And that also has consequences in practice that we have also seen in the past 2 days at this conference already, so that when different actors are coming together to discuss hate speech, a lot of energy is also spent in discussing what are we actually talking about, what actually is hate speech, can we agree on that? So that is a challenge that remains. Another challenge that will persist in the fight against hate speech is that it is very difficult to regulate on policy levels and regulating in, for example, working together with tech companies. There's always this balance that needs to be met, as many speakers have already said today, between allowing free speech, allowing freedom of expression, freedom of religion, but then also combating hate speech. More concretely for religious actors, there are also a range of practical challenges. And KAICIID has done a number of consultations this year asking for the needs of religious actors in the fight against hate speech. And many have expressed a need that they need to feel better equipped in the fight against hate speech, but I also want to acknowledge the frustration that was shared in some of these meetings, especially when it comes to hate speech that emanates from within religious groups. So there's also a lot of frustration of religious leaders in how to find better ways, how to combat hate speech coming from their communities. All of this means, all of these complexities of hate speech means that it is a problem that needs to be tackled on several dimensions, and we have to focus both on the policy level. It is incredibly important to work on the policy and regulating level, but also to look at these bottom-up ways of increasing social cohesion, so that we can increase society's resilience in the face of increasing polarization and of increasing hate. So in other words, hate speech is one part of the problem. The other part of the problem is that we have to ask ourselves, why are people listening to hate speech? So it's those two dimensions. And the research has shown that religious actors are working in many of these different areas on countering hate speech. Some are addressing the phenomenon directly, and some are working on this wider social context in which hate speech occurs. And I want to give you just a few examples. Of course, I can't go into much detail here. Some initiatives have done great work in monitoring and analyzing the hate speech that is directed at them, both in collaborations but also on the organizational level. And those initiatives have shown that the more you understand the hate speech that is directed at you, when it happens, how it happens, the better you can plan responses and think about the needs that you require to fight this. A lot of initiatives, both by religious actors and organizations working closely with religious communities, are focusing or offering education and training to counter hate speech. There are a lot of materials, very well done materials available, how to do counter speech campaigns, how to create alternative narratives. And a point I would like to particularly mention here is trainings on religious literacy that some initiatives are offering. Other initiatives are working to strengthen religious communities' identities. And this may not sound like working directly on hate speech at first sight, but they are arguing that the more secure and confident one can be in their own religious identity, the less they are threatened by other people's identities. So in the end, this also works to counter hate speech. And other initiatives are working on reflecting about the power of language and the power of communication. Especially, and this is especially true for religious leaders, as we've also heard a few times this morning already, religious leaders are working through communication. So being more mindful about how you communicate and what kind of words you use can also set examples of how to speak about certain issues and how to speak about certain groups. There are three areas that I would like to highlight in the remainder now of my input on where policy making should focus on, particularly given the current situation. The first area would be to think about how to create and to support successful cross-sector collaboration, and to really think about what makes partnerships meaningful and sustainable. And why does this need to happen now? There are more organizations, there are more actors who would like to engage in countering hate speech activities. So now we are at a time where more coordination is needed, and to also make it more effective. And the questions for policymakers here is particularly how to make them sustainable, but also how to have clear goals and have clear purposes of such collaboration, that they can also be sustainable. A second priority area to focus on is and remains changing narratives, focusing on narratives. And why is this important at the moment? It's because also the threats are increasing. We are now seeing that there are a lot more malicious actors that are spreading not just hate speech, but also misinformation, conspiracy theories, and all of this mixed sort of messages in a much more organized way, using different forms of media. So it is ever more important to work on creating positive narratives. And we had the discussion yesterday to not forget the role of media in this area, both social media, but also traditional media, because it is one area that really influences public opinion. And then there are also, but when it comes to religious leaders, there are also a lot of indirect ways in how organizations and initiatives are able to shape narratives. The actions of religious leaders, the actions of religious communities can challenge stereotypes and can challenge existing narratives. So it's also a question about becoming more visible in wider society. And a third and last area that I would suggest to focus on that remains incredibly important is building cohesive societies. Of course, this is a very broad topic, but this is also where religious communities and religious leaders can contribute a lot. And this concerns both improving relationships between religious communities, but also between religious communities and the wider society. And this also includes what some have already mentioned also today, working also within a religious community, working to promote openness and inclusivity in one's own religious community, encouraging youth groups, encouraging women groups to participate in religious in meetings or in events, and also to increase exposure between religious communities and outside or members of the wider society, particularly where there are minorities. To conclude, I would like to say that both the input paper that you're able to read, that is available here, as well as the larger paper, there are still work in progress. So for the remainder of the session, I will be sitting here taking notes and to listen to your feedback, to your input, and to learn a little bit from the wisdom that is in the room, to incorporate this in the publications later on. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Meek. We are going to move very swiftly on to the Reverend Dr. Richard Sudworth from the Anglican Church in the United Kingdom, who's going to respond to the paper.
Right. Thank you, distinguished guests. Dr. Meek, thank you for your paper. There is much to be welcomed and to challenge all of us to considered action. I note Dr. Meek's assertion that no one solution will be sufficient, and that a range of approaches, collaborations, and timescales are needed to shape our approach to hate speech. Picking up on the point that has been made frequently over this last 24 hours, that hate speech is difficult to define, in my response, I would want to identify and distinguish hate speech that threatens violence and intimidation, for which the laws in our respective countries should be able to respond. One of the vagaries of social media and the anonymity that it affords so many people is that too often threats can be made against individuals and groups with impunity. In my own context in the UK, after the tragic murder of the Member of Parliament David Amess last week, I know that there is pressure to force social media companies to prohibit anonymous posts. But once we move away from the obvious arenas of legal sanction and social media regulation, we are on much more uncertain and unpredictable ground. What one person regards as hate speech may well not be such for another. In our febrile world of instant messaging, offense can come in many guises. Context and specifically power relations are all factors in what we may regard as hate speech. The UN definition that we have heard already mentioned refers to sentiments that are simply demeaning. And when taken in isolation, I wonder that we need to be careful that we avoid becoming a kind of informal police on these matters. Let me show you, and I hope it comes up on the screen now, a cartoon that recently appeared in the Times newspaper of London. On one side, there is a figure of Voltaire, that symbol of modern liberalism. Liberalism that very easily contains its own illiberalism. The quotation reads, "I do not agree with what you say, but I will defend to death your right to say it." On the other side is the fictional figure Volatile. "I do not agree with what you say, and you will die if you don't say I'm right." The ultimate symbol of illiberalism, or the keyboard warrior. Certainly in the UK, whether we are talking religion, sexuality, gender identity, race and ethnicity, to name just a few issues in which our discussion on religion needs to be put in context, there too often seems to be a binary debate between free speech on the one hand and varying forms of the denial of speech, whether through violent or other means, on the other. Cancellation being one word that I use with some judiciousness. This binary oppositional approach has echoes of what the Roman Catholic political philosopher Charles Taylor describes as buffered selves, debates between selves that bounce off the two protagonists without any progress or meaningful solution. Taylor contrasts this with an approach he describes as porous selves, where we begin to engage, treating the other human, with proper seriousness, and where both parties change, even when they may still disagree on some fundamental matters. It's this kind of engagement that I would want to affirm as a particular gift of religious communities to the challenge of hate speech. I present this with a conviction that religious beliefs, a horizon pointed towards and determined by God's providence, ought to give us a stronger sense of security, and I note Dr. Frederica's points on this, to risk the verbal and written barbs of others. Let me illustrate this with an example. On Easter Day of this year, during the festival that Christians hold as the most important in our calendar and central to our identity, when we believe that Jesus Christ, who was resurrected from the dead, a celebrated atheist academic and TV presenter tweeted this: "Just a little reminder today, dead people don't come back to life." Note that this was on Easter Day, when millions around the world will be celebrating in churches. It was insulting, insensitive, and definitely demeaning. What ensued was the typical pile-on of social media responses. In the red corner, supported tweets that weighed in on the ridiculous and irrationality of religious faith. In the blue corner, outraged Christians suggesting that this professor and celebrity should have a tweet taken down and be banned from presenting on television. This is an example of buffered selves. The Archbishop of Canterbury chose to write to her, apologizing for the weight of negative Christian responses and reaching out to her pastorally as someone in public life who was suddenly in the firing line. This is an example of porous selves at play. I think back to early summer of this year and incidents in Jerusalem and the Gaza Strip that rightly outraged many across the world, but also occasioned an explosion in hate speech online across our faith communities. I was involved in a number of private discussions when we tried to move the debate beyond the mutual rhetoric and insults to something where we had deeper shared understanding so that the nature of our discourse could be much more responsive to the other. Again, even if there were still huge differences in political opinion. I recall one moment when a British Muslim was asked what came to mind when she heard the phrase, "Free Palestine." Her reply relayed something of autonomy, self-determination, democracy, security, stability, safety from attack. A British Jew was asked what she heard by the words "Free Palestine." Her reaction was the end of a Jewish state, relatives in Israel with no home or even killed, no safe country to go to if anti-Semitism got worse. What we suddenly had was an exchange where both parties began to understand each better. I welcome the proposal for greater religious literacy and widened participation of religious actors, but I also want to challenge us who are religious to the serious work of humble engagement with those that sometimes challenge, accuse, insult, and even offend us, to do the hard work of encounter. In the cultural wars we live in now, it's a gift of our religious traditions to be secure in practice and belief that we can model this to others. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those very important words. We're now going to go to Professor Mark Owen, who's Secretary General of the European Council of Religious Leaders, a part of Religions for Peace Europe, who is joining us online.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you well, thank you.
Well, firstly, sorry I can't be there in person. I was planning on coming, but was prevented at the last moment. So apologies for that. If I may, I'm going to offer a few brief comments, as I know we're trying to be brief, on the excellent briefing paper. So congratulations, Dr. Meath, and the accompanying recommendations, and make a couple more general observations and suggestions. So the paper, in my view, offers an accurate summary of many of the discussions and concerns we've been having in the European Council of Religious Leaders, in Religions for Peace, and I've heard often in many interreligious circles. It also pleasingly takes note of the current evidence base, which I think is important in my other role as an academic, and which is too often ignored, I think, in what works in countering hate speech, particularly online. So congratulations and thanks again to Dr. Meath. It makes some specific recommendations for faith actors also, many of which I'm pleased to see, as well as noted, is already happening in many religious communities, although of course we can always do more. I was really pleased also to see the report rightly note that hate speech, its causes and effective responses are inherently contextual and require context-specific approaches and responses. Therefore, giving individuals and organisations the tools and the frameworks to better understand and respond to hate speech in their own context is vital. And this is something certainly we're working on at Religions for Peace Europe, led by the European Interfaith Youth Network. We're working on a project which is in partnership with UNICEF that is trying to counter hate speech, particularly against refugees and migrants, because of the impact that has on children. The project's developing an evidence-based social media toolkit which guides non-experts on assessing the risk and responding to hate speech in their own context. So it's in quite early stages at the moment, this project, but we welcome all interested collaborators. The more the better in our view. So if anyone is interested, please do get in touch and I can send some more information. Interestingly, the current research suggests that more reactive and legislative approaches have limited impact, and whilst of course are an important dimension of our approach to tackling hate speech, punitive approaches tend to reinforce narratives of victimization and exclusion and actually push hate speech elsewhere rather than end it. I think, however difficult it is to accept for some of us, we have to accept that social media platforms in a variety of forms are here to stay, and hate speech will not be ended, unfortunately, through legislation alone. We discussed yesterday in some of the working sessions about the importance of education, and research shows that education is particularly effective, a particularly effective approach, especially when it's targeted at encouraging people to be more critical and reflective about social media and what's posted on social media. This, for me, is absolutely vital. We need many more initiatives that critically or encourage people to critically question the mechanisms and intentions of social media. And perhaps many of us have seen the Social Dilemma documentary and the revelations in that. We need to get people to question more the implicit intentions, modes of communication, the impact on our societies and communities of social media. And there's no doubt its tendency towards simplistic communication and that the way it encourages the search for mass audiences and communication encourages extreme and divisive positions. At our research centre, also in my other role as an academic in the UK, we're doing some work in this area, and we're drawing on our experience of conflict transformation in contexts around the world. And I just want to end by sharing a couple of brief ideas and propositions which might be of interest. We need to remember that hate speech is a cause of division and violence within our societies, but it's also a symptom and expression of perceived grievances and often fear. It may be an uncomfortable truth, but people who perpetuate hate speech, who are discriminatory, racist, prejudiced and violent, are often individuals and groups who feel disenfranchised, bitter, resentful and full of fear themselves. And time and again, we see this in situations of conflict where hate speech is perpetuated against others because individuals and groups have narratives of victimization, disenfranchisement. They feel out of control of their own circumstances, feel they have no other options, and are angered by their own impotence in society and the world. This is in no way intended to condone hate speech or behaviour. Indeed, we do and should condemn hate speech in the most unambiguous ways. However, if we want to effectively address hate speech and division within our societies, we must recognise that these people often see themselves as victims and are to some extent a product of their environment. We must ask ourselves and our governments, I think, some very difficult questions. Do we exist within societies, or do the conditions exist within our societies which make hate speech more likely? Do we live in fair and just societies and communities? Do our political leaders and our systems, and indeed our religious leaders, model the types of behaviour we would like to see in everyone? Do our societies and politics value collaboration, relationships, respect, empathy, or do they model antagonism, division, confrontation, power, and winning and defeat in our systems and our speech? So whilst I'll endorse all the recommendations in the report, I think I'd want to ask whether they go far enough in addressing the root causes of hate speech and the root cause of division and disharmony in our societies. We need more initiatives that don't simply condemn and shut down the people who perpetuate hate speech, marginalising and dismissing them, and often pushing that speech just underground, but learn how to listen respectfully, modelling exactly the type of behaviour we want them to use, disagreeing unambiguously but also constructively, maintaining our dignity and kindness and our own religious values. By not doing that, we drive people to marginal positions and create the exact conditions for hate speech and violence. Again, the research shows this clearly. This is an area I believe religious leaders and communities can make a unique and absolutely vital contribution. And as suggested in another session, I support the proposal of an interreligious task force mandated exactly with the task of attempting to engage directly with those perpetuating hate speech, listening to their reasons, whilst making absolutely clear it is in no way condoning or legitimising, but making a real effort to understand and enhance their knowledges of the grievances. A religious body with the knowledge and expertise and wisdom to connect with those people who perpetuate discrimination and hate, and counter them not in a condemnatory and punitive way, but through building bridges and countering their misguided views through kindness and engagement. when people feel listened to, and again, we see this in conflicts around the world time and time again, no matter how unsavory their views, it often dissipates feelings of anger, hatred, fear, which often drives conflict, and we can begin to address then the root causes and problems of hate speech. This is how conflicts usually end. That's what the evidence shows. And most importantly, this is how peace is often sustained. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much. I think some very important suggestions there. We're now going to turn to Sheikh Dr Al-Qadri, and please go ahead.
Thank you. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Distinguished guests, first of all, I'd like to thank KAICIID for inviting me to participate in this very important dialogue. We all know from experience and knowledge the devastating impact hate speech and hate crimes have in our societies. How hate speech can create division, radicalize a person into thinking and acting in a us versus them narrative, and lead to aggression, discrimination, and dehumanization of others. And it is this dehumanization that then can lead to violence. I want to start with saying that I believe that faith communities, minority communities, while they have and usually are on the receiving end, they also could be perpetrators of hatred, bigotry, and racism. And this is because no community, no faith community is really immune to radicalization. Our Jewish communities can be Islamophobic. Our Muslim communities can be anti-Semitic. Anti-black racism is a huge problem in some Arab communities. Even within Pakistani and Indian societies, there is a complex complexion discrimination. Within Europe, some Muslims can be worst perpetrators of homophobia. Within Ireland, many new migrants that chose to make Ireland their home blindly adopted anti-traveler racism, which is very prevalent in our society there. So I believe that as faith leaders and as people that believe in accountability in a higher power, that while we demand our rights, we also hold ourselves socially, politically, and spiritually accountable. A multidimensional approach is required to tackle hate speech. And firstly, a sincere and honest reflection from all of us is required. This multidimensional approach should be from a legal, educational, and social angle. Many countries in Europe do not have hate crime legislation. It is firstly important to have hate crime legislation at EU level against xenophobic hate speech and hate crime. However, criminalization legislation isn't the only way forward and isn't the solution. While it does combat hate crime and hate speech, it does not prevent it. So a robust response will come through cohesion, integration, and bridge building. So firstly, collaboration between faith communities is required. 3 years ago, or almost 4 years ago now, European and Muslim scholars, imams, muftis, and European rabbis came together in Amsterdam to establish the MJLC, Muslim Jewish Leaders Council, in order to collaborate on many future projects to tackle challenges our faith communities face, such as hate speech. Although the prejudice about each other is mostly not found on leadership level, and in fact, rabbis, imams, muftis get really well on together. I remember just before the pandemic hit, we had a meeting in Matera in Italy, and it so happened that it was my birthday at the same time. So would you believe, imams and rabbis were all singing happy birthday for an imam. And that all happened on leadership level. The real change that is required is on grassroots level, because most of the prejudice we find on that level. So more collaboration is required on that level, and religious leaders should promote the value of peaceful coexistence and inclusivity, especially within their own communities. And I believe all faiths, all religions, whether it is Islam, Christianity, Judaism, Hinduism, etc., all have a strong foundation. And the essence of all these faiths is peaceful coexistence and inclusion. And the essence of all these faiths is humanity. So I think that the remedy to change the grassroots level is education. So once we know more about each other, we will get rid of the misconceptions and the fears that we have about each other. So as faith leaders, firstly, we need to educate our own faith communities. Within our faith communities, I believe there is a lot of ignorance about how our faith can does in fact encourage peaceful coexistence. In Ireland, a couple of years ago, we tried to challenge that within our community by inviting a Jewish Holocaust survivor into the mosque. Not only that, we went a step further. The next Ramadan, we invited members of the LGBT community to come and join us for the iftar dinner. The impact that had on the society, a lot of anti-Muslim sentiments, Islamophobia, we got rid of it. And in fact, the general public welcomed us so much that during the pandemic, when we were all hit in our faith communities, places of worship were closed, we had the challenge of where are we going to pray our Eid prayer. And do you know, we as Muslims in Ireland, we had the largest support from the larger community to have our Eid prayer in the most iconic Irish venue, which is Croke Park. This would not have been possible if we did not reach out to the larger community and have dialogue with them and try to get rid of the misconceptions and misunderstandings. I also believe that reporting hate crime should be easy. A lot of faith communities, members of faith communities do not really know what to do if they are targeted by hate speech or hate crime. They don't know where to go. So there needs to be training within faith communities, organizations, regarding what is hate speech and when someone is a victim, where can they go to? Not only that, I believe it is also important to have training for policymakers, important training for people that work in law enforcement agencies, because institutional racism, unfortunately, is a reality in certain cases. And how do you get rid of them to ensure that there is even training within those sectors about what is discrimination, what is hate crime. And when somebody comes to you to report a crime, it may look from the outside to be a crime, a theft crime, for example, or just vandalization. But in reality, the motive behind could be hate crime also. So this is something that I think there needs to be more training also. And faith communities, usually, and faith leaders are willing to play a role that can bring solutions on the table. But these faith communities and faith leaders often lack resources. And I think supporting such councils like the MJLC and other networks where faith leaders come together to combat the challenges our societies face, to support them is extremely important. And once we faith communities have the support, the leaders have the support, I think we can play a very important role in making the society that we all live in, and it's our society, it's our Europe, to make it a more peacefully coexisting society and a real pluralist society for everybody. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We're now going to go to Professor Regina Pollack, who is the personal representative of the OSCE chairman person in office.
Yes. Dear Excellencies, dear Eminences, ladies and gentlemen, greetings from Vienna. I'm really sorry that I cannot participate in real life. Thank you for the invitation, however, and also congratulations to the great research results from Mrs. Mead. Hate speech and hate crimes continue to be a concern in the OSCE region as its latest hate crime reporting documents. In particular, the COVID-19 pandemic has resulted in numerous instances of stereotyping, racist scapegoating, and stigmatization. The pandemic-fueled hate-motivated attacks and various forms of online intolerance and discrimination and incited to violence and discrimination against vulnerable groups and minorities, including religious communities and their observants. These worrying developments also threaten the social cohesion of societies, they damage trust and solidarity, and are toxic for democracy and human rights. Thus, the pandemic has added new layers of complexity to address and combat these phenomena, also for the OSCE, whose participating states in their commitments have strongly condemned racism, xenophobia, and have regularly committed to combat hate crimes. As the OSCE participating states are aware that a state cannot create and sustain a culture of respect for diversity only by itself, they stress that among many stakeholders, also religious communities and faith-based organizations have an important role to play as part of the OSCE's comprehensive efforts to address intolerance and discrimination and to combat hate crimes. In particular, the OSCE recognizes the importance of promoting and facilitating open and transparent interfaith and intercultural dialogues and partnerships. Regarding countering hate speech while respecting the freedom of expression, let me stress some aspects I consider important to strengthen the cross-sector collaboration between religious and belief actors and the OSCE. Religious and belief actors, including religious leaders, are essential collaborators for the OSCE, as they are often important influencers and accepted as moral leaders in their communities and sometimes also in their societies. They can speak out and condemn hate speech while respecting the freedom of expression, and they can respond to intolerant and hateful ideologies. With their positive messages and alternative narratives, they can foster mutual respect and understanding and can strengthen inclusive and cohesive societies. They can also support the OSCE to understand and to address all the different reasons and drivers of hate and hate speech, such as emotional, cognitive, social, cultural, historical, spiritual drivers. Based on their convictions of the equality of all human beings, they can contribute to a peaceful coexistence among individuals and communities from different religions, beliefs, and cultures through interreligious dialogues and partnerships, both in words and deeds. They can stand by and counsel and support victims of hate speech, both individuals and communities, and by this demonstrate solidarity. By promoting dialogue among different religious and faith-based communities and between religious communities and the wider society, they can provide spaces and platforms where people can learn about the beliefs and practices of other people and communities, and they can experience diversity as a gift and as a resource. And they can help to implement and foster the recognition of and the respect for human rights, as they share many of the normative human values human rights are based upon. Based on these capacities, I recommend some aspects. Religious and belief actors can and should systematically condemn hate speech firmly and in public, also reminding governments, political actors, and parties of their duty to uphold the OSCE commitments. Religious and belief actors can and should support the OSCE in monitoring and reporting hate crimes, including disaggregated data collection. These are important tools for the OSCE, which help to protect individuals and communities, including their buildings, from attacks, and they can raise awareness. Religious and belief actors can and should provide and strengthen religious narratives, stories, and traditions that foster virtues such as tolerance and forgiveness, the recognition and value of diversity, as well as reconciliation and the unity of humankind. Of course, this needs religious literacy also within the faith, the believers. Religious and belief actors can and should also pay attention, special attention to women, as these are often victims of gender-based hate crimes, with single and multiple bias motivation in which gender intersects with race, ethnicity, and religion. And religious and belief actors can and should intensify the establishment and institutionalization of interfaith and interreligious dialogues and encounter, and build coalitions to promote intercommunity solidarity on a sustained basis. Such interreligious and interfaith coalitions can be influential role models for mutual respect and lived diversity for society, and they can also strengthen resilience to hate and provide structures to support in times of crisis. This all needs expertise. With numerous tools and reports, programs, and trainings provided by ODIHR, the OSCE stands ready to support religious and belief actors to further develop the important capacities of religious and belief actors and communities. With its fact sheets on hate crimes, ODIHR can support to identify, monitor, and report hate crimes. On the OSCE hate crime reporting website, reports, data collections, educational material, etc. can be consulted. With its trainings, ODIHR can encourage community leaders and members to develop skills how to identify and combat hate crimes. Last but not least, ODIHR's practical guide on condition building for tolerance and non-discrimination provides multiple resources and presents good practices and step-by-step instructions how to create successful coalitions. The OSCE is aware that the contributions of religious actors are not only valuable, but most necessary and indispensable to combat hate speech by respecting the freedom of expression and promote societies based on tolerance, non-discrimination, the recognition of diversity and human rights. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Polak, for your very interesting remarks. And now we're going to go to our final panelist, Professor Peter Petkov, who is Director of the Religion, Law and International Relations Program at Regents Park College.
Thank you very much. As the last speaker, I'll also probably the most boring legal contribution to the conversation, partly because I'm a lawyer and partly because most of the important and interesting things were already said by the previous speakers. However, I was asked to reflect and respond to some extent to input paper 5, and that's what I'm going to do. And to me, it seems a very important paper, and any further comments I would make must be seen more as encouragement to go deeper, further, and develop something which looks excellent. And what I find particularly interesting and at the same challenging about this paper is that brings together things which are very close to my heart. Engaging and challenging hate speech, imagining and dealing with the challenges and the opportunities of cyber law and cyberspace, and trying to calibrate cyber law and cyberspace in similar or different ways from our civic spaces, our conventional civic spaces. And if there are different ways of doing so, why are there different ways? Why is this cyberspace different? And finally, how could religious voices make a meaningful contribution to those conversations? How could this conversation be different and go beyond merely endorsing existing policy? How do they do things in a more meaningful way or complementary way, but also push the boundaries of recommendations, guidelines, very useful, very effective, produced by the OSCE, by the Council of Europe, by the European Union, through the jurisprudence of the European Court of Human Rights or the international organizations. And here lies the problem. In most of the engagement I've been involved with religious voices in the public sphere, religious voices tend to shy away from bringing their authentic policy impact and tend to operate more as endorsing existing policies rather than trying to push the boundaries where policy fails. And hate speech may be one of those opportunities, but again, it presents challenges. And one of the challenges, particularly challenge I see in this paper, is that the engagement jumps straight into hate speech. As a lawyer, I'm obliged to remind our collaborators and our partners that there is a very obvious reason why Article 20 of the International Covenant for Civil and Political Rights comes after Article 19, because they have to be read together, and we cannot engage or confront hate speech in any meaningful way unless we start from freedom of expression. And any taxonomy of dealing with hate speech would be having freedom of expression always as our starting point, followed by any limitations to freedom of expression, and then followed by a very clear mandatory assertion that all state parties to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights have a mandatory obligation to confront hate speech. So hate speech doesn't have a freestanding status. We could choose to engage with something which is in our way, and we have to put it away. There are plenty of authoritarian governments around the world which do that, and they do it pretty well. When Bill Clinton praised the discovery of the internet and how this is going to produce the free world, the Chinese responded, watch us, and they created the Great Firewall of China. And we now live in the world which is divided between the one extreme of US approach to freedom of expression through the First Amendment and the Great Firewall of China, with Europe sitting in between and increasingly looking like a swinging state moving in one direction or another. Now, what could the religious voices do about this? Well, firstly, any meaningful policy engagement would involve a very meaningful understanding of why religious voices engaging with policy. How do they fill the blind spots which policymakers create by not engaging fully with hate speech? There are some very positive initial steps, but a better understanding of actually the taxonomy, the starting point of freedom of expression is critical, and many religious voices are lagging behind, partly because historically religious voices had a very problematic relationship with freedom of expression. And this is one thing we have to urgently engage with and confront if we have to have a meaningful engagement with hate speech. The second level, policy making, as far as the cyberspace, as far as big data, as far as hate speech is concerned, has tended to be more reactive rather than reflective, partly because technology evolves faster than law, and policymakers never have time to actually come up with reflective laws to embrace the change. Well, we need more reflective laws. We need imaginaries, visionaries who could imagine in what way cyberspace, cyber law could create civic dialogical spaces, could create cyber civility in a similar or in a different way from our civil society, but also engage with the question in what different way that would be. And religious voices in many ways have been doing this very effectively in trying to help international community, international organizations to imagine international law more as a living document or series of documents with a broader normative landscape rather than with law with teeth, which has for years been missing in the international discourse. And last but not least, it is critical that any religious voices do what you're doing very effectively, very well, but calibrate it with existing monitoring mechanisms which are already doing a very good job. And endorse those monitoring mechanisms in order to strengthen their position and keep putting pressure on state parties to fulfill their obligations. I like an earlier communication that when it comes to hate speech or preaching truth, individual religions have their claim for monopoly on truth. And their role cannot be to push and use hate speech as a way of justifying some kind of trivial way of engaging with borderline blasphemy or with not necessarily very savory theological position. But the role of religious leaders and religious communities is to really remind the states that it is their responsibility to maintain freedom of speech and freedom to pursue ideas and seek truth, holds governments accountable in the same way it's their responsibility to protect freedom of religion and belief. And last but not least, the great prophet of media studies and the studies of the internet, Marshall McLuhan, once said, medium is the message. It doesn't matter what the message says. It matters how it is conveyed. So while we try to confront fake news, post-truth, and hate speech online, we must be very careful. If we keep producing too many documents, too many statements, and trivialize our engagement with hate speech would become meaningless, and it would be much harder to deal with the big challenges and the big dangers behind hate speech. And let me remind you something. As far as Article 20 is concerned, which is the blueprint of, with which we engage with hate speech through international law, was historically put there to remind us that the international community is committed to not repeat the atrocities of the Second World War. Since the creation of Article 20, the only meaningful engagement with Article 20 has been to condemn trivial academics who have engaged with tasteless and unscholarly Holocaust denial. It hasn't stopped any of the atrocity of the post-World War II. It hasn't stopped Srebrenica. It has not stopped Rwanda. Has not stopped the ethnic cleansing of the 21st century, and increasingly has not stopped the increasing cultural, religious genocide. Now, our role is not only to engage with something which is very important, but to engage in a coherent, meaningful way and provide policy, palatable action plans which policymakers actually understood and use, rather than get buried by recommendations, guidelines, toolkits. They would increasingly not be able to go through or comprehend, almost like a first-year law student who has read too many books and then doesn't know how to use them. And on this, I shall rest my case.
Thank you very much, and a salutary message on not burying policymakers with too many recommendations, but really refining them into the most effective messages that we can deliver, and that's what we hope will come out of this meeting and our engagement in the future. We do have a question from the online audience about religious literacy and how we can improve that. How do we improve knowledge of each other's faiths, and how does that engagement help us? I wonder if any of the panelists would care to respond. Please go ahead.
Well, since 2005, there has been a big conversation about how religious engagement with policy represents a very complex dialogue between legal and secular and religious legal cultures, and how the two perspectives enrich one another, and how in this process religious actors learn better that international human rights, international law is no longer seen as a competitive theology with which they have to engage apologetically. And this has been remarkable. Religious actors have learned much better and more effectively how to act and relate to the policy spaces. There is a lot more that could be done, but the transformation has been remarkable. The focus on religious literacy, in my view, has been problematic because it has put too much emphasis on the assumption that policymakers are basically religiously illiterate and they have to be enlightened. And some of the projects have been absolutely balming. I mean, I've seen at least one which was developed by a foreign officer I'm not going to name in person, which was involving the diplomats with the most trivial and the most pointless process of understanding how religious communities work, rather than trying to engage with the most sensible aspect, which is how religion is a factor of policy formation, domestic or foreign, and how the governments, policymakers, diplomats, parliamentarians could leverage in relation to that. There are some initial stages of moving in this direction, but they have been disappointingly slow and disappointingly ineffective. We want to see more of that, and we want to see perhaps more of a coordination between various diplomatic academies which engage with that and exchange good practices. Some do it better, some do it worse. But just to give you an example, I was asked to update a text for one diplomatic academy about Eastern churches. And the text was a very long rant about how the Eastern churches understand the Holy Communion and how it's transubstantiation and this, that, and the other, completely esoteric, and absolutely no line about who are the leaders, what is the religious leaderships, where are the power bases, how you should engage with them regionally, internationally, and how would you build meaningful relationships. So there is a lot of investment in religious literacy, but I don't think that there is a real intellectual focus to calibrate it as something which actually delivers goods.
Okay, thank you. We're going to go to Dr. Meach and then to Dr. Al-Qadri.
I just wanted to make a quick intervention, because I think it's also a great question for this conference. How can we think about increasing religious literacy? And I just wanted to add a point that I found really enlightening in the research, that it is not just, religious literacy is not just about knowledge, it's also a competency. So it's not only knowing how religious communities work, and that doesn't only mean sort of knowing the scriptures, but it's also knowing about practices and how people live in their everyday lives. But this is also a competency in the way that religious literacy entails how kind of an ability to deal with one another, an ability to deal with people from another faith or non-believers. And in that point, it is not only something that outside actors have to learn, also religious communities have to know have to be religiously literate. So that's a point for reflection, perhaps.
Dr. Al-Qadri.
Yes. Religious communities, faith communities represent diversity. And I think if we have more appreciation of this diversity within our educational system, that'll bring a change. Most of the perpetrators of hate speech, hate crime are not academics, they're not intellectuals, they're not faith leaders. All of that happens on the grassroots level, as I said in my speech. A couple of years ago, I would just want to share you an experience that a couple of years ago, I was approached by a Christian faith leader, and he wanted my support on a letter. And the letter was to a school board. And the letter was basically saying that we are extremely appalled by the school's policy to have an LGBT week and to celebrate this diversity, and our children have to do homework regarding LGBT challenges and all that. So he wanted my signature as the Muslim faith leader, as a faith leader, to also have on that letter. So I actually respectfully refused, and I said, instead of this approach, my approach would be to go to the school and tell them, look, we understand how important it is to have LGBT week, to teach our children about diversity, sexual diversity, and that it is not okay to discriminate against another child or another person because they have a different way of life. The same thing, what about Muslim faith communities? Muslim communities are facing Islamophobia. I think in your school, you should also have the policy to have a Muslim week where you talk about, where you have the imam to come to the school to speak to the children, you have the school children to go to the mosque, and similarly, you need to celebrate all types of diversity. There is a lot of anti-Catholic sentiments that we have in the society right now, so therefore, the priest should also be able to come and speak to the children. And you know, the school board, the management, they accepted this. And you know what happened? After that, we started the whole series and program of school children going to the mosque and imams going to the children. And one of the things that really struck me was we had children coming into the mosque, and of course, 400 or 500 can, come in the mosque at one time. And for many of these children, they're 14 years old, 15 years old, secondary school students. We all have been teenagers. We know how respectful we were at that time for the other. And what happens is, you could see when these children were coming into the mosque, they're discussed. They weren't feeling, they were making fun about it to each other. And as an imam, I could observe all of that. And some of them were annoyed that they had to take out their shoes. And they sat there for 45 minutes or so. They listened to me talk, and they listened to a sister, Muslim sister, to talk about her life. And at the end, these students came to me and the sister, and they said, "Thank you so much, that was so enlightening." That is the kind of change that we had, that impact that we had. So I think religious literacy is all about starting from a young age and to teach about the other. It's not about religion, theology. It's not about what do Muslims believe in. It's about, look, this is their culture. This is the way of life. But at the same time, they're still like us humans. They have families and all that. Thank you so much.
Good. Thank you. Professor Barak, please go ahead.
Literacy, I think there are two levels where we have to debate this. The first level is, I think, that religious communities and institutions today face an enormous challenge to reinterpret their traditions, their texts, their practical traditions in the light and in the horizon of a transforming society, which means they must be interpreted in the light of a pluralistic world which is growing together. This is one aspect, which is not easy, I assume, and it's also a challenge for the education of religious leaders who must be educated in this modern way. On the other side, religious education, I think, must also be a public concern, especially in societies where we perceive a decrease of religiosity and an increase of secular attitudes, which means every human being, also adults, not only children, must be able to learn about religions and how religious people live and how religious people practice.
Okay, thank you very much. Do we have any questions from the room or any comments that anyone would like to make? Certainly, gentleman over here.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your contributions. My name is Sanait Kobelica. I'm Chief Imam in Norway, Islamic community, Bosnia-Herzegovina in Norway, and Chairman for Muslim Network for Dialogue. I would like to tell you 2 or 3 things in short. These 2 or 3 days, I have been listening to different experiences, contributions, and I have impression that we are inventing hot water that already exists. What I want to say, you have very important example that is called Norway. Comparing with other countries, European countries, in Norway, you know that we had some days ago, most probably they don't want to call it a terrorist attack, but it likes a terrorist attack, and they want to call, or we don't want to call it the far right, but I think it is the far right, and it would be the third terrorist attack by the far right in one European country. And first one was in 2011, and it was a shock for many, but most importantly for politicians and for media. They woke up. They woke up and they thought, is this possible? Because since September 11th, so we were talking about Muslim extremists, Muslim terrorism, and so on. And suddenly we got Breivik, white man, Norwegian man. So something is wrong, something we have to change. And really it happened. It happened 1 or 2 years later, but unfortunately we got quickly that the Breivik attacks happened. Why? Because the IS or Islamic State came in already 2014, 15, refugee crisis, and our populist politicians used that opportunity to go back to the rhetorics before Breivik. And what is shocking, the ordinary people also, allowed to be deceived. They forgot that the Breivik happened, that the far right is danger for us all. Yes, Muslim extremists, stupid people, danger people, they exist. And we have to face that challenge, that danger. And that the politicians went back. Unfortunately, in 2019, we got another terrorist attack on one mosque. Again, the far right, inspired by the Breivik, inspired by the New Zealand attacks, and so on. So it was the second alarm for the politicians, for media. My impression that much has been changed since that attack. Our media is, according to me, the media we were not used to. We were not used to. They are now. They are very careful, trying to be objective, trying not to spring to conclusions. We have politicians, we have the government who needed months, only months, to get the action plan first in Europe, action plan against Islamophobia in place. After 1 year, it was launched. So we have the action plan. Of course, we have to work on it now. How we have to give it, as we say, some meat. What we got, I just want to share this with you. I mean, it is okay to work on the grassroots level with mosques, literacy, education, and so on. But I think what we mentioned several times here, these 2 or 3 days, we have to get in touch with the policy makers, with the people who decide. We have to be, aggressive in terms of pushing those processes. In Norway, we have managed to do that since the Breivik. We have no problem to contact the cabinet of Prime Minister, our Prime Minister, and we meet her or him. We meet the intelligence service, we meet the police, and we talk often with them. We want them to do the job. They didn't take it seriously after 2011. They took it seriously after 2019. Because it is not only about the Muslim extremists. I just want to say this, Mark. Moderator. What we got in place after this 2019, we got the Ministry of Justice promise, and I think they do that now. For the first time, they started registering every incident of hate, attacks in their register. It's not only that we register it, and we have to do also our part of the job. We have to register it, every single attack, every single bad word, and of course, we can send it to them and they register it there. In our communication with intelligence service and police, we requested them, and I think they do it now. Please, okay, individual Muslims groups and so on, they are problematic. You should keep eye on them.
Excuse me, I hate to interrupt, but I'm afraid we do have to wrap up our session shortly. But thank you very much for your very useful, very helpful advice on some of this. And I think Norway often leads the way in many policy areas, and so we have much to learn from that. But thank you very much. I would just like to give our panelists one sentence each, really, to summarize very rapidly their views or what we should focus on. Where do you think the policy priorities lie? Reverend Sudworth, maybe you'd like to start.
Let me go back to the issue of religious literacy. I think one thing that can be learned, conscious of some of the reservations around the kind of religious literacy training that is out there, is that when we come as people from religious tradition, we come as whole people, and that many of our policy makers, politicians, don't realize that our faith is not like being part of a cricket or football club. It's not this little activity that we do one day of the week. We bring the whole of ourselves. And I think as we engage with hate speech and greater understanding across our differences and recognizing difference, that's a good starting point.
Right. Thank you. Professor Owen, I wonder if you have any final thoughts to add.
As I said earlier, the emphasis on education is hugely important for me, and also increasing our understanding of the causes. I think there's some evidence and understanding at the moment of the drivers of hate speech, but I don't think yet we clearly understand well enough exactly why it's being perpetuated, and certainly then how we go about addressing it and tailoring our approaches to different contexts.
Right, thank you. Professor Polak, would you like to make a last interjection?
Yes, I have 4 short points. First, I want to stress the legal level. Implementing hate crime legislation in every state, I think it is most necessary. Then I want to stress the responsibility for religious leaders, both within their communities and in the political field. The grassroots level is important because it is the basis for an inclusive and cohesive society. I want to quote my colleague Kishan Manocha, in the spirit of learning and understanding the other. And I want to add one aspect. We have to look for the roots of hate, for the diverse roots, which is not only based on religious or ideological and identity politics questions, but also from economic and social conflicts we must deal with. We must understand it in a broader way to be able to combat hate speech and hate crime efficiently.
Right, I'm afraid we have reached the end of this session. Apologies to the remaining panelists, but thank you all very much for fascinating contributions. We would urge all of you to stay in touch with us and to send in any further thoughts that you might have so we can develop our policy paper. And now I'm going to hand over to my colleague to make an announcement.
Thank you so much for that inspiring discussion. The topic of hate speech is indeed such a challenging topic, and I have the feeling that you have been able to flesh out a lot of aspects that need to be kept in mind. So thank you to our distinguished panelists for their contribution, and also to the audience, both virtually and physically, for their thought-provoking comments and questions. So I would just like to announce that our lunch break is taking place here on the same floor in Eduardo 7. Anyone taking halal or kosher food will find them signed. We will continue after lunch break with the panel discussion. I know the food can be succulent, but please don't forget to check in your room which chosen panel discussion is taking place, to dive deeper in one of the 4 aspects that we've been highlighting in our plenary session. So also in the attendee hub, you can see which track you have been signed up for and read the input paper that goes along with it. Enjoy your lunch, and thanks again. Enjoy your lunch, and thanks again to all of you that made this morning's session so insightful and allowed for a lot of learning. Thank you very much.